Welcome to Troweling Down, Biblical Archaeology for the 21st Century. I'm Gary Byers, this is Dr. Stephen Collins, and have we got news for you. Last time, you talked about something called SDS, and it had to do with your 25 years of research on the site of el-Hammem and the biblical city of Sodom. You want to explain to us what SDS might mean?
Yes, the amount of evidence that el-Hammem is in fact Sodom is so, that pile of evidence is so big, and the evidence for any other proposed site for Sodom is zero. Doesn't even amount to a molehill. There's all the evidence is in favor of el-Hammem, but there are still a range of folks, scholars and other people, who resist the identification. And they do it for one reason or another. Now, since the evidence is so in favor of it, in fact, there's more evidence that el-Hammem is Sodom than the city of David is David's Jerusalem. Ophel is the site of David's Jerusalem. I mean, there's so much more evidence. There really isn't anything going on over there other than the geography that tells people that that's what's happening there. But at el-Hammem, we have the advantage of actually more geographical data embedded in the biblical text in the Old Testament for the location of Sodom than even for Jerusalem. In fact, it's the number one city in the Bible as far as the data embedded in the text that tells us how to get to the city.
The geographical location is more about Sodom than there is about Jerusalem.
That's right.
Interesting stuff.
So why do people still try to push off the idea? Why do they push it away? Why do people just all of a sudden, when Sodom is brought up, and it doesn't happen with Gezer, Lachish, nobody freaks out. Hatzor. Just bring up a biblical city and nobody gets too excited. But you bring up Sodom, that we have found the city of Sodom, everybody all of a sudden starts finding reasons that, well, you got to be careful. How can you make that identification at this point? They just go crazy. They don't want to allow it. The interesting thing is they never assess the evidence. They're still operating off the ignorance that they have between their ears on the subject of Sodom and its location and everything that relates to it. They're still on the old conventional wisdom, and they haven't paid attention to the evidence. Now that's all going to change as our final publications for el-Hammem start to come out. You know, several volumes of scientific publication that talk about what we excavated over those 16 excavation seasons. Now, quite a bit's been published already, but that's going to be the big one. But why do people still resist? Well, I came up with a bunch of symptoms that people have that keep them from embracing the idea that el-Hammem is Sodom. And I thought, well, you know, it's kind of like a syndrome. In medicine, if there is something wrong with somebody or a bunch of people, you have some symptoms, but nobody knows why. Nobody knows what the cause is, but people still have these symptoms and they have this problem. They don't really know how to treat it, so they kind of treat it symptom by symptom, not as far as getting to the root cause of it. And this in medicine, they call a syndrome.
So you have detected, outside of medical science, a new syndrome.
A syndrome. It's hard to put your finger on exactly what the cause of it is, because most people don't want to admit that they even have it.
A syndrome.
That syndrome. But what it is, it's a collection, and I've identified 10 symptoms.
Of the same syndrome.
Right, that constitute this Sodom Derangement Syndrome.
Sodom Derangement Syndrome. You heard it here first. And
now, we're not saying that if you don't believe that el-Hammem is Sodom that you're crazy.
Okay, that's
Now you
probably a
might
good
be,
point.
but it doesn't mean you are. Because derangement doesn't necessarily have anything to do with one's mental condition. But it does have a significant amount of meaning for one's intellectual condition, or shall we say intellectual honesty, or lack thereof. Now, let me just go to an objective dictionary and give you this. This is the Cambridge Dictionary.
That's a good one.
I mean, how can you go wrong
Really,
with Cambridge? Here's what they say. They give this example for the word derangement. Keeping quiet about a crucial piece of evidence is a sign of stupidity bordering on derangement.
That was the Oxford Dictionary.
That's the Cambridge Dictionary.
Cambridge.
Yeah, so the whole idea is, and by the way, it's a French word. Derangement, something like that. You know, it's purely a French word, derangement. And what it means is, in France, if you turn the light switch on and it doesn't work, or if you turn the radio on and it doesn't work, or if you try to turn your car on and it doesn't work, the word that's used there is derangement.
It's not arranged properly.
It's not functioning as it should. The things that need to be in order and properly related to produce the right kind of physical result that you're seeking, like your car starting, are not. There's something in there that's broken. The chain of logic, the chain of whatever needs to happen to create a result is not. Something's wrong with it. It's not proper. So that's all derangement means. And so in terms of intellectual pursuit or scientific pursuit, it's that when people refuse to consider they either are ignorant of it or they choose to ignore it. And I think you can use the word ignorant either way. They either are ignorant of the facts or they choose to ignore the facts for whatever their select reason is. And either way, the Cambridge Dictionary says this is a sign of stupidity. Now, I didn't use that word. I didn't name it Sodom stupidity. I just named it derangement, bordering on derangement. In other words, not to take into account all the things, all the elements and pieces that need to be put together in order to make a proper scientific determination of the reality of something or not. All that has to be considered. And you can't ignore anything. Everything that plays into it has to be taken into consideration. And so what we feel, and the reason I picked Sodom Derangement Syndrome, is there are people out there who will just instantly say, no, won't believe that Sodom even existed. They will categorically eliminate any idea that Sodom could even, these are mythical, they're legendary, they have nothing to do with reality, these are fictitious stories that have been made up, and they will just instantly push it away. The problem with that is, we'll deal in a minute, that's my first symptom, is that first knee-jerk reaction that, everything that the last 150 years has told us about the Torah, about the first 5 books of the Bible, especially the book of Genesis, all of that tells us that all this stuff is myth and legends. Myths and legends. And it can't be taken seriously. So as a result, then they just think they don't even have to listen to it. They just hold it at arm's length. They don't have to listen to it. Here's the problem with that. And we may as well launch into symptom number 1. So the first symptom is ignorance of or ignoring the outmoded conventional wisdom of so-called higher critical theory, or some people call it the documentary hypothesis. And this is what is taught. This is the dominant view of the development, particularly of the Torah, book of Genesis, and then, of course, of the rest of the Torah scriptures, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And this is the dominant theory, the dominant idea of how all of that came to be. The problem is that it can't be sustained. And we also have to realize that the original theory was debunked very soon after it got off it just didn't get too far off the runway, and it crashed and burned because it was done in the late 19th century. It was derived, it was conceived in the minds of scholars between the 1850-ish on to the end of the 19th century, in an era when there was no scientific archaeology at all. Yeah. Archaeology had not even hardly begun to be considered as a discipline in and of itself. And also the discipline of ancient Near Eastern studies and comparative ancient Near Eastern literature was in its formative stages and not terribly advanced. So the two things that would have killed the existence or the rise of higher critical ideas to begin with were not even existing at the time. So this theory grows up in a vacuum without any comparative possibilities to other ancient Near Eastern literature, and certainly not to archaeology that can shed light on the background of the Torah scriptures as to their historical veracity. And so within the first 25, 30 years of the 20th century, virtually every pillar upon which the higher critical theory was based were all knocked down. For example, they thought that the phonemic alphabetic writing system that was needed for Moses to write something like the Pentateuch or the Law didn't exist back in the 14th or 15th century, when the Bible sort of straight up says this is when it happened, back in the Bronze Age. This was a late Bronze Age phenomenon. And but they said, well, wait a minute. How could Moses have written this stuff we're looking at in the Torah? Well, an alphabetic system, a Semitic alphabet, didn't even exist back then. Now that was the state of knowledge in the second half of the 19th century. But within the first 25 or 30 years of the 20th century, that whole concept began to evaporate. And who was the guy who started that ball rolling?
Evaporating it?
Yeah.
William Foxwell Albright.
Well, Albright and, before him, Petrie.
Yeah.
Flinders Petrie. Yeah. They began to discover the Semitic alphabet on inscriptions in various places without, that went back before the time of Moses.
Kirbet el-Sadim. Yeah.
So, and now today it's even worse. Now we know that the alphabetic script has now been pushed back first to the 15th century, then to the 17th century, then to the 19th century, and there's even possibility that it could be now pushed back to the 25th century, which that's amazing to me. Now, we haven't really confirmed that yet, but at least goes back to the 19th century. This is 400 years before Moses. So what's the problem? There isn't a problem. It was only a problem in the 19th century when their level of knowledge did not actually allow them to think in those terms. And so they said, well, then the Torah must have developed from the 10th century when the alphabet was, in their minds, invented, and it must have happened, the evolution or the development of the Old Testament text, the Torah text mainly, happens from about the 10th century down to about the 5th century. BC, of course. Now, when you look at that, you go, no, wait a minute. This is now you and I, as archaeologists, we know this is the second half of the Iron Age. This is the latter half of the Iron Age. And the latter half of the Iron Age, I promise you, is culturally, ceramically, objectively different than the Bronze Age. In fact, it's even different than Iron 1. Okay, so what you get in Iron 2 is a totally different world, completely different set of cultural phenomena that are very foreign to the Bronze Age. And of course, the Bronze Age would have been extremely foreign to them. They wouldn't have known anything about it. Here's the point, and the point is very simple. If you look at the Torah, if you look at the stories in Genesis, you look at the stories of like Sodom and Gomorrah and all the detailed geographical elements of that, and all of the stories of kings and so on, which will carry us over, by the way, into symptom number 2, of all of these things culturally and socio-politically going on in those stories, it points to the Bronze Age. Everything about the Torah scriptures points to the Bronze Age. The concepts, the ideas, the modes of thinking, everything points to the Bronze Age. In fact, prices of slaves, Bronze Age. Prices, concepts of covenants, contracts, and treaties are all written in an authentic Bronze Age manner. Something that late Iron Age folks would know nothing about. And my point, so let me just summarize it, just distill it down here. Nobody writing in the Iron Age could possibly have written the first 5 books of the Bible, because the first 5 books of the Bible are crammed full of Bronze Age ideas, concepts, materials, and even linguistic elements.
So just as a reminder here, the Bronze Age is the Canaanite period in the Holy Land. The Iron Age is the Israelite period, and we've got 2 different cultures, hundreds of years apart. They really don't match, and there's no indication that the ancient Israelites of the end of the Iron Age, that they had any documents from the Canaanite period. They didn't have that kind of stuff. We dug them up in the 20th, 21st century. We're digging them up. They didn't have those. So it's a whole different ball game. And so many of us who've thought about it realize that. Sadly, many of our colleagues do not. And that's why we're talking about this stuff today. So some of them can think about it. And,
Exactly.
And you individually, you've had these conversations, and some light bulbs have gone on among colleagues.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so I picked this as my first symptom of Sodom Derangement Syndrome, that people just categorically, without much thought, deny that any of the stories related to Sodom and Gomorrah and fire out of the sky and all that could possibly be historical. They dismiss it out of hand.
Sodom Derangement Syndrome. You heard it here first. Stay tuned. We've got more. Thank you for joining Traveling Down. We look forward to seeing you again real soon.